At Foda Media, a group of volunteers have come together to publish what is newsworthy, with no narrative-feeding agenda. For years, Lebanese media outlets have been bought, monopolized, and made to promote or push for a political agenda, more recently resulting in the twisting of the truth. Foda is an independent media platform born in the early weeks of the Lebanese October Revolution. We produce videos, publish articles, and create other types of creative content to help our society grow beyond the expired narrative promoted by local mainstream media. To keep Foda on its feet, following and releasing stories, we need your help. So far, we've been surviving on the little money we had saved from our day jobs before the economic crisis, and a few food boxes from generous friends. This financial roadblock seems difficult to overcome, so we are asking of our friends, independent and free-minded individuals, to support us by donating to Foda Media's GoFundMe. Check out our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for more information. Thank you.
So this is a conversation with Ayman Makarem. He's a Lebanon-based writer and filmmaker who recently wrote essays on mutual aid in Lebanon for the public source. One of the themes of this podcast is to promote mutual aid for the 21st century, so I was really looking forward to speaking with Ayman about this. In addition to reading his essay, this has been a topic that the two of us have been discussing since Lebanon's October 2019 uprising. We both found that there were structures that were lacking within revolutionary settings in Lebanon that could allow for a much longer lasting movement, and the same could be said for most of the rest of the world. Mutual aid is simply voluntary, reciprocal exchange of resources and services for mutual benefit. Most of us already practice it with family, friends, and/or communities without really feeling the need to label it. The problem starts with the fact that mutual aid is seen as something that arises out of a state of exception. For example, as we go through an ongoing pandemic, more people everywhere around the world have been reported to be willing to adopt quote-unquote exceptional societal measures to ease the burden. But what those of us arguing for mutual aid argue for is that we shouldn't need a state of exception to think of ways to build a fairer society, and we obviously believe that mutual aid is one way of doing that. As usual, you can follow the podcast on Twitter @FireTheseTimes, and if you like what I do, please consider supporting this project with only $1 a month on Patreon or on buymeacoffee.com, and you can also do so directly on PayPal if you prefer. Patreon is for monthly, PayPal is for one-offs, and buymeacoffee.com has both options. Thank you for your time.
My name is Ayman Makarem. I'm a Lebanese writer and filmmaker and researcher. And I've been thinking about sort of radical politics for a while now, but especially since October 17, and have really been struggling and doing quite a bit of research to try and find practical, solutions to the problems we see in front of us that both address the political and the material.
So this will be what I hope to be the first of many episodes on mutual aid in the context of Lebanon. And the idea really is to kind of give some kind of general overview of what mutual aid is and what it can look like, what are some of its differences, let's say, with charity, for example, or philanthropy for that matter, which we'll get into in a bit. But the reason why personally I'm that interested in mutual aid is that I really feel that it's one of those things that is intuitive to most people. So if you don't call it by name and you just say stuff like we should live in a society that's fair and where people are helping each other out and all of that, most people tend to kind of be on board already. There's no real name for an ism, so to speak. So can we start by you telling us a bit about what has interested you in mutual aid?
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, you did hit on quite a few things, and there's sort of this. First, it's born out of necessity, right? That especially now in Lebanon, we see that there is dire need for just direct aid, for assistance. Like I said before, we talk about any of these grand ideals that we have and the society we want to live in. There are people that are just materially starving or unable to pay rent. And what I really appreciate and what I really love about mutual aid and what gets me so excited about it is that it does it in such a way that doesn't forego the political or the revolution. I agree. I think it's very important to frame this in relation or in opposition to charity, partly because most people know what charity is and are familiar with the dynamics of charity, but also because it in comparison, they both reveal the ideological roots of or the ideological presuppositions involved. So, yeah, in loose terms, yeah, mutual aid is a system of organizing around aid, right? It seeks to build communities and cooperative communities that meet each other, people's essential needs. Charity is also an organizational structure built around aid, but obviously it's a very top-down organizational structure, and it's very transactional. That essentially you would. I'd like to use the example of food distribution. That at charity, as we all know, you would go around and hand out food indiscriminately. Well, targeting the poor or targeting the hungry. So if charity is handing out food, mutual aid is more akin to creating a communal kitchen. Um, Something like the Foods Not Bombs programs, that is a sort of a global network, um, is a kind of structure wherein you get people would um, acquire food from local producers. Imagine a khadarji here, a grocer has produce that he's going to throw away. It's not yet rotten, but it's no good to sell. And so you collect that food, put it into this kitchen, process it, cook it, and distribute it. And what this includes is not just the sort of more sustainable, more grassroots structure, but it also kind of breaks down the barriers that charity has of I am the giver and you are the givee, or I'm the helper and you're the helped. Because you can imagine that these communal kitchens, as in a lot of cases, is run by people who also use it. And so it sort of creates this naturally non-hierarchical structure. It doesn't always have, it sometimes does have hierarchies, but the fact that it's a sort of paradigm shift, it's a change of thinking. It's not I have a lot of money and you don't, so I'm just going to give you a bit. It also what I said earlier, that it exposes the ideological roots, um, that sort of it betrays the ideological presuppositions. Is charity, you kind of get the sense that there's not really much analysis as to why these poor people are poor or hungry people are hungry. They just
Yeah.
are. It's almost a fact of nature.
Yeah, like a
And
fact of life, yeah.
yeah, and so like these are victims of circumstance. It's a tragedy, haram, mazlumin. Just like but that kind of only goes so far. And so what you find is that charity kind of supplements capitalism because it doesn't aim at the root structures. So it supplements and in some cases perpetuates capitalism because it doesn't really address the root causes, and so it functions as a band-aid. Arundhati Roy writes a beautiful passage about this. What is it called? The neoliberalization of resistance, or something of the sort. But oh no, she creates a term, the NGOization of resistance. It's a fantastic article. But essentially, mutual aid stands in opposition to that. By aiming at the sort of grassroots level, by organizing non-hierarchically, it sort of aims to empower communities and change the root circumstances. So you imagine that community kitchen, it sort of approaches the problem at its core. It's not, these people aren't then reliant. It's not a transaction that then you go away feeling good about yourself. It's a long-lasting community that ultimately aims towards sustainability, autonomy, and cooperation.
There are two things that got me into mutual aid in a sense. One was the sort of the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in the United States, and the other one was especially in the early days of the Syrian revolution, so 2011, 2012, 2013 to a certain extent, and that sort of continued and continues to the present day, but at a less at a lower level, so to speak. One thing that the Hurricane Katrina story for me kind of debunked in a sense is this idea that when disaster hits, the kind of the common plot in it's a common movie trope, like something bad happens in the world, and essentially what happens is that it's dog eat dog, like everyone's gonna try and kill one another, everyone's gonna start looting everything, and like everything is just one person or maybe one family against one family, and that's it. People stop thinking about their neighbors, for example. But what we actually see in many cases, like in the case of Hurricane Katrina, is that people actually come together because, as you said, mutual aid is actually born out of necessity. And we saw these soup kitchens, of course, but we also saw these, I think they call them disaster reliefs, that were functioning on a mutual aid basis. So you had the big charities that came in as well, and that many people that work in these charities and volunteer for these charities, these are good people. They obviously don't mean badly, but they would do things, and as you said, it kind of it only goes so far. And so the people involved in mutual aid, usually kind of like anarchists and other people kind of hovering around, if you want, that kind of politics, and people who don't define themselves as anything as well, they kind of come with this additional critique, if you want. But it's not a critique as in like they stand at the door of charities and they yell at the charities. It's more of a critique through action. So they just kind of show that there is a way also of doing things, that it's almost like through their actions they show the limits of charity. So if you have enough resources to create a soup kitchen, why that barrier between those who are giving and those who are receiving? You can also create something that's more communal, like a communal soup kitchen, and this is where mutual aid comes into play. In the case of Syria, it's more the local councils. I'll let you kind of talk about this a bit more, but when I discovered the local councils and even the coordination committees in the early days of the 2011 uprising and revolution, it was also this necessity. Like the state withdrew from certain parts of Syria, was either forced out or like tactically withdrew to focus on other parts, as it tried to do in the early days, and that obviously created a necessity. It's either we organize ourselves and we find a way to create an alternative to the state, or we starve. Like it was really that simple and that basic. And obviously people opted for the former, as one can imagine. And they did so through various forms of what is ended up calling the local council. So various ways of organizing, either to like it was democratic to a certain extent. Some local councils were more democratic than others. Others were a bit less so. Some had kind of like a religious undertone or overtone. Others not so much, and so on and so forth. So with that in mind, can you talk a bit about some of these contemporary examples of mutual aid that have, let's say, that have inspired you personally?
Yeah, no, I'm honestly kind of ashamed that I didn't know about these local councils and about this sort of grassroots movements in Syria until quite late in, only a few years ago, when basically most of them were destroyed or co-opted. Um, yeah, and to think about when I became interested in mutual aid, it's hard to pinpoint a specific time, but I've always generally been very interested in the sort of daily life of these superstructures we live under. Um, that not just because obviously it's very important to pay attention to capitalist exploitation at the superstructure level of Jeff Bezos and of ExxonMobil and all these things, but also just how we interact with one another. Me going to the grocery, me going, how I live my life. And so that was articulated to me brilliantly by Ahmad Aziz. And there was a sentence in one of his manifestos, one of his essays, that just summed this up, exemplified this perfectly. He says something, these councils would be where the revolution meets the everyday life, or something of the sort.
And Omar Aziz, for those who don't know, was a Syrian anarchist thinker.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of these movements obviously are grassroots and are born from the communities, but in terms of he is one of the brainchilds, or the local councils is a kind of brainchild of his. That yeah. So and the local councils for me, and all these the sort of organizing that was involved in Syrian cities and towns that we saw, between 2011 and 2015, and it still sort of exists. To me, when those really became clear in my head, it was after I started asking myself, how are these cities surviving under siege? That siege is such like a what's the word? A totalizing event. There's nothing coming in, going out. There, you have these underground passages and everything, but we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people, and for 3, 4, sometimes 5 years under siege. Now, what amazed me when I sort of discovered about these local councils is it proved the strength of some of these forms of organizing. That under the most utter dire circumstances that human beings can be under, that communities can be under, that structures like these can actually work. And so, yeah, I've arrived at sort of mutual aid and anarchism in general by a sort of, I mean, in 2008 I was a liberal. I loved Barack Obama and everything. Around 2000, yeah, 11, 2014. Ashamed to admit, but I was a bit of a kind of a, I wouldn't say tanky, but kind of a bit of an obnoxious leftist. And it was sort of, I don't know when it really started to happen, but I started to move away from these things and trying to find these sort of third ways, and not neoliberal third ways, but like I still have these leftist tendencies, but I don't agree with the manifestations of the state. And so mutual aid served as that kind of, it is so basic. And I'll go through some examples, but for me, mutual aid always, it is what you do with friends, it's what you do with family. It's
Exactly, yeah.
But it's also what communities do. A story that I often tell whenever I sort of go through mutual aid is my uncle, who, whenever I'm in my village in the mountains and he's there, you every single time, at least one person shows up, sees his car, goes up to him and asks him, "Hey, I've got this thing, my elbow, or my wife has this problem," um, and he gives them advice. He doesn't prescribe them anything because that's, I guess, kind of legal, but like he sort of tells them this and that, and if it gets any worse, whatever. Because, well, I don't know, he's got a sense of community. That, let's say, if it's the butcher, if the butcher were to fall ill and die, if we take like a fully free market approach, that's terrible. It's terrible for the community. It's terrible for everybody. Um, but so there's kind of this natural mutual aid. We do have a natural understanding that what's good for the community is good for the individual. It's good for all of us. And I see a lot of the superstructures that exist today as kind of covering and clamping down on those and destroying those natural bonds that have taken hundreds, thousands of years to sort of form just naturally. I see, and mutual aid does have that sort of historical depth. I know you wanted me to talk about contemporary examples when I immediately jumped to the historic.
No, that's fine. I mean,
Yeah, but in thinking about how fundamental mutual aid is, one of the early thinkers of mutual aid is a man named Peter Kropotkin, who was a Russian anarchist in the late 19th century, and how he, even though there were actual mutual aid societies preceding him formalizing it in these words, which I'll go through in a minute, he came to the idea of mutual aid as a factor of evolution. He was a zoologist as well as an anarchist, as well as a prince. But essentially, what he observed was that despite the mainstream notion that evolution is a process of domination, of competition,
survival of the fittest.
survival of the fittest, in fact, there was also quite a lot of cooperation that he saw, and you can see it every day, not just in society, but also amongst animals. That there's a lot of symbiotic relationships between animals. The pack animals hunt together, not because then the strongest of them will take the animal and eat alone. It's because it's good for the majority, for the collective. So we can see that mutual aid is kind of a fundamental thing. It's almost kind of boring people find it kind of redundant for me to, like you said at the beginning, help each other, cooperation. It sounds like natural phenomenon that doesn't need to be formalized.
The way I try to think about mutual aid, there are two different dimensions to it. Kind of just to kind of complicate the story a bit more. To I think it attracts attention if you want, because if we just say, well, we need to help each other, like most people kind of just agree with that statement. It's a very basic statement, which is a good thing. It actually shows that like it is something very basic. It's kind of like an instinct as well, because we are extreme social creatures, and indeed one of the struggles that we're having right now with the pandemic is that the basic social instinct that we have has to be ruptured due to the social distancing. And so the two dimensions that I'm mentioning is, one is I'm trying to argue, and I mean I'm not the only one doing so, but I agree with this method if you want, that the economy actually has four sides to it. It's not just the binary of on one hand you have the private market, and then you have the public, and the public equals the state. And usually the story is, if you're a leftist, then you want more of the public slash state, and if you're a right winger, you want more of the market slash private property, or private stuff in general. And like the four-sided approach, if you want, that I'm proposing is better, and as I said, it's not mine, is that yes, you have these two. These are just a fact of life in most societies. That is the current societies we live in. These two do exist. But you also have the household slash family. I'm gonna say household to be more progressive about it, because it doesn't have to be just family in the traditional sense, obviously. And then you have the commons. The household is very important because it's actually obviously is gendered in most societies in the world to this day. Domestic work, if you want, is not counted as labor, is not counted as part of the market or of the public for that matter. It's not taxed, obviously. It's not like someone who works at home, like let's say a mom who works at home, is paid an hourly wage or anything like that. And then the fourth dimension is the commons. Now the commons basically means everything that can be commonly owned or commonly shared, let's say, to not use the word owned. And mutual aid sort of addresses the latter two. It addresses the household, and it addresses the common. The common is, as I said, the like public parks, a forest that is not managed, so to speak, or everything in between and beyond, depending on the context. But the household is very important because we already practice mutual aid in most households, where, let's say, a relationship between the parents and the children is a healthy relationship. We're not talking about the toxic ones and abusive ones. Obviously, that's a different story. But this is what mutual aid actually means. Like when I think of what I can do towards my sister, and like the way we interact towards one another, it's not the transactional things, in the sense that she owes me $17 from 10 years ago, and therefore I'm not going to help her. If it's much more fluid, and this kind of fluidity is actually what mutual aid is about. It's about not having to maintain a debt when it's about friends, or it's about you always have these exceptions in real life. Like if it's a friend, you don't necessarily keep tab on how much that friend owes you, again depending on the circumstances. But that is the general idea. And the second dimension is something that is called the donut economics, and it's a funny word because it's actually shaped like a donut. I forgot the name of the theorist and the writer behind it, but if people just Google donut economics, they'll find it. And the idea is that there should be a lower limit and an upper limit to our economies. And the lower limit is like social safety nets and all of everything related to social safety nets, like homelessness, poverty, hunger, water safety, Wi-Fi, internet actually is included these days as well. Anything that people need to stay afloat. Like this is what people need in life, to not be drowning in debt, or to not find themselves on the street, and etc., etc. Whereas the upper limit is the planetary limits. So climate change, obviously, like the ozone layer, soil degradation, ocean acidification, all of these things that we also need, obviously, to live in a healthy environment on a healthy planet. And for me, like the fact that we need to be in between a lower limit and upper limit, and the idea of donut economics is that saying, let us at least agree that there should be this lower limit and upper limit, and then we can have kind of a discussion on how to organize societies better. For me, that is the spirit of mutual aid, because what it says is you have to have social safety nets for people so that you no longer have these extremes. So you already eradicate these extremes. And then you have to have obviously by extremes I'm talking about like extreme poverty and so on. And then you have to have the upper limits for basic survival, like so that future generations can participate in our world in the same way that we supposedly want to. And mutual aids kind of come in between those two. Now, donut economics, she doesn't frame it in the way of mutual aid, and in many ways it's actually one might argue it's kind of like more social democratic or maybe democratic socialist take on things, and it will always have its limits. But the general idea is really the fact that we need to think about our world beyond just growth, beyond just unfettered growth. More is better. We organize everything around our lives on GDP, and then we only think about the national debt and all of these things. The idea with all of this is that we need to kind of upend all of that logic to kind of have a better logic, a more sustainable logic, and a more mutual aid oriented logic, a friendlier logic, to use a much more basic term. Now, in the context of Lebanon, the popular uprising that we've been seeing since October, and now obviously there are ups and downs to it and everything, one of the things that for me it highlighted is how little prepared we are to kind of deal with emergencies, and we are not well prepared for it, in my opinion, of course. And we can agree on this or disagree on this, or maybe I'll ask you to just expand on like basically just have your take on this. Is that up until now we haven't really thought outside of just small circles of our societies as being able to be built, like to actually function around principles like mutual aid. So we only think about mutual aid in a sense when, as we said in the beginning, it comes out of a state of necessity. So essentially, okay, well, now we're in a state of emergency, state of exception. This is not a normal way of doing things. So now we can allow ourselves to be more decent to one another. It's a bit surreal when we put it into these terms, but that is essentially what happens in case of a pandemic, and which is what we're seeing now. We're seeing all of the polls that I've been reading in the UK, in Spain, and I think Mexico. I read in the Philippines. No, it was Thailand. Sorry, and other places. People have kind of shifted and become more progressive about things, saying things like people should be supported, they shouldn't lose their jobs, they should have some basic security, safety nets. They shouldn't be criminalized if they cannot pay, for healthcare. Healthcare should be free. Like, people are more likely to accept these things that because now we're in a state of exception. And I guess my frustration with all of this is that why do we only think about how to be more decent towards one another when we get to a point where we have no other choice other than to be more decent towards one another? Does that make sense?
No, no, it is very interesting that like, and it's quite upsetting because it sort of feels that these shifts should have happened earlier, and that now that it's become a necessity, it's almost harder to do them. And I see this in a lot of different cases. There's sort of that like the big awakening after Trump was elected, that like, oh, now we must form this new movement to what's it called, but it almost felt like not too late, but like surely there was enough room under like the Democrats that you could form these things and not have to deal with all the inanities that are coming out of the White House since Trump was elected. It is a paradox, and I find it is very frustrating. But I do like the analysis. I do agree with you that the sort of initial burst of the October Revolution kind of exposed our unpreparedness, especially us that are sort of more politically engaged, more politically sentient. And I think I've heard this discussed, and I find it very interesting that a lot of people talk about the WhatsApp tax as being that sort of like initial trigger, and just in terms of like the timing, it explicitly was. But the fires in Shuf, the sort of like the wildfires that happened, I think only like a day or two earlier,
Yeah, 2 days before, yeah.
yeah, exposes that exact same unpreparedness, and um, and the fact that what are we living in? What kind of state is this? Where just you literally have thousands and thousands of trees and acres of just burning to the ground, and well, I find it very poetic that the government, the state had nothing to deal with it, and I think there were reports that they were using riot water cannons to turn off the
They did.
fires. that's genius. Like, because that just exposes that the state has really reduced its functions to just you know, protecting private
Yeah,
property and
yeah,
riot control and
repression.
everything. Yeah, it's but interesting there as well. I think there's a Palestinian camp nearby where their firefighters came out and helped and everything. There was um, a crowdfunding. I forget what the website's called, but it's an Arabic crowdfunding website. Within a day or two, raised about $50,000 just because. And I really saw that energy really build into October 17. That same like this is fucked and we need to sort of like work together to deal with it.
Oh,
Um,
the timing was phenomenal because it was, yeah, this built up of energy and anger, both the same things at the same time. The catastrophic failure of the government on one side, and the fact that people actually stepped up. Like at the end of the day, for like listeners who don't know, the reason why these fires were actually put out was like a combination of luck because it started raining after 2 days, and the fact that some foreign governments, I think Greece, Cyprus, and Jordan, donated like a few planes, and
yeah,
the fact that volunteers actually stepped up to help firefighters. So the Palestinian firefighters were one of them, and then you just have people living in the area to just come out and try to extinguish the fires. Um, that is mutual aid. Like that's the thing. It doesn't, like, I don't need to call it anything else. That is what people did. The fact that there is a forest burning down and we need to stop the forest from burning down. So that's it. Like it doesn't, it when something like as basic as that happens, and then we go back to the question of necessity. You don't think about like what is the most cost effective way of extinguishing the forest fire. What is the best way of the most market friendly way of turning off the fires? Like, these are not the calculations that we make.
no, exactly. And when this happened, around October 20, I tried writing a poem. I'm a terrible poet. I don't do it, but I'll just stick to articles and screenwriting. But because there was such a poetic kind of symbolism to the fires, the waters that turned out the fire, and the idea that like the masses of people coming out into the streets represent that same rain that'll put out the fires in the Grand Sarai and whatever. It was a
Yeah,
terrible
yeah.
poem. It's completely convoluted, but I think the poetry still exists. And I've actually heard Naomi Klein use similar imagery. The idea that there is this fire that's burning. She talks about like two different fires: the fires that's burning, which is climate change, but then also this like competing fire, which is global grassroots protest movements. But I agree. The idea is it's not. Yes, there's this fire. I mean, climate change. I find it phenomenal that no one's like people don't. I get panic attacks when I think about it. That it's just holy fuck, the world is on fire. And when Brazil and the Amazon and Australia, just like we had to do something. And there's that urgency, that necessity, that because it's the most basic fundamental thing. And I think this is where Kropotkin really comes in, where it is at the moment a matter of survival of the species. That it's not, we're not trying to think of, yeah, well, how do we go about this and what's, and it, and that's why I'm very skeptical of any capitalist kind of solutions to the thing, because the problem is competition. The problem is thinking about things in terms of growth, because we cannot think about how can we put out the fires that are literally destroying the world with thinking, well, how can we make it profitable? And this goes back to what you were saying, and I 100% agree. Mutual aid does service a new type of economics that disagrees with growth, because obviously the basic phrase that we can't have infinite growth with finite means and finite resources. It's just uh, paradoxical. And so mutual aid really does service it. I think what I love about it, it really does redefine economics. It does, because economics are what is it? We're so wrapped up in GDP and wrapped up in all these things, but it's how we relate to one another and our resources, and how do we actually provide for one another and go about social and economic relations. How do we deal with one another? And a mutual aid brings it back to the fore, brings it back to the core, and it sort of Do we want to treat each other by competition, skepticism? What have you done for me lately? Or is it more about I care about you because you're my neighbor, and because if you know, and if we think about friends, obviously it's much more natural. I love my friends. I want the best for them. So if they come up to me and ask me for help, I don't ask them, well, what can you do for me? Because there's this sort of reciprocity. Um, I do really like the example that David Graeber brings up. In David Graeber is an American anthropologist slash anarchist. Um, he brings up a really interesting anecdote of an anthropologist going to Madagascar, I think it was, and living amongst the sort of, I forget exactly what the context was, but the core of the story is that people start giving her gifts, right? She just is inundated with gifts left and right, and she has no idea what to do about this, and she's happy, but she doesn't know what's going on until someone comes up to her and breaks it to her and tells her, well, listen, I'll let you off the hook and tell you what's going on. No one will tell you, but in giving you gifts, these people are expecting you to give gifts back, right? Or give something back. But it's essential that you give them something of less or greater value. Because if you give them something of equal value, you're basically telling them you want nothing to do with them. But if you give lesser or greater value, you're perpetuating the cycle of debt, of social indebtedness, and that it implies that you want to continue this relationship. And and I love this story because I do this. I realize I do this with my friends. Someone invites me to dinner, and I want to invite them to dinner, and back and forth, and sort of that like I'll let you pay this time, but next time it's on me. And so that's I feel more, aside from capitalism, aside from how we're used to living our lives nowadays under all these oppressive systems, that's sort of more at the core of it. It reminds me of the village. It reminds me of that mutual reciprocity, that I love my neighbor, therefore I want the best for him. And so, yeah, I think mutually does really service that new thinking of economics as and new ways of relating to one another outside of competition.
And the key thing about um, the whole like next time's on me is that the next time is not defined,
Yeah,
and the difference. So that is what differentiates it between basically paying for your friends or letting your friends pay for you, and you taking out a loan from a bank.
yeah.
At the end of the day, you have to pay back the loan,
No, exactly.
and usually with interest.
He uses the example to kind of because I find this very fascinating. There is this kind of myth of bartering that
Yeah, yeah,
in
yeah,
more.
yeah, yeah.
So he says like because it doesn't make any sense that I pay you dinner and it's $25 and then I have to buy you literally a $25 like shawarma to. So it is more vague and more because the feelings of love and reciprocity and all these things are very vague. It's just yeah.
Yeah, I know for a fact that I have friends that if we were to apply capitalistic logic, either I would owe them thousands of dollars or they would owe me thousands of dollars, and we have no idea how much we owe each other, yani.
Mm.
And so the idea isn't that the idea really is that we I guess the let's say the sentiment that you and I are trying to get across here is that everyone already practices mutual aid on a day-to-day basis with their friends and family, sometimes with their neighbors if they're close to their neighbors, and we actually see this. Like, so I will say something that might sound weird at first, but like work with me here. the When we think of some because I work in cultural studies, so it's a lot about like I look at media, I look at TV series, at movies, at books, and that kind of thing, cultural productions, let's say. When we feel this homey feeling about villages in TV series, like there's this Netflix TV series called Sex Education, which is super popular and everything. The thing about that village is that it is both in a lovely environment, so it's a beautiful place, there's forest everywhere and everything, and people are biking everywhere, and it's also a multicultural environment. So it's almost like this impossible place in most
Mm.
places. Sorry, in most countries, because usually it's urban areas where you have a higher diversity in that sense. So it's kind of like the best of both worlds in a sense. But for me, the reason why, for me personally, I get this um, cozy feeling in a sense. The reason why we're so attracted to TV series, no matter how problematic they are, where you just have friends hanging out and doing something and everything, is that you get to know them. So that is the, I think it's called a para something relationships. You end up kind of how do you say this? You end up sort of relating to this fictional character as though you have a relationship with that fictional character, but more importantly, you sort of live through them. And this can obviously reinforce loneliness if the sort of the ideal situation that you're seeing on screen isn't reflected in real life. But more often than not, what you're sort of craving is just that human interaction. What you're craving is that you can go down, you live in a second floor apartment, you go down, you walk a bit, you can go to the cafe, the local grocer, the local whatever, and people sort of know each other, if not by name, at least, they would say hi every now and then. And you sort of had this familiarity. And mutual aid for me is sort of picture that sentiment, the coziness, the feel, the community feeling and everything, but put it in practice on a wider scale. So the idea isn't just that we should just have a small community where people are nice to one another, but then when they get out of that community, it's dog eat dog, and we can, just live under, again, this capitalistic mindset. Just the basic logic of why you would be nice to your siblings and why you would be nice to your parents and community, again, friends and neighbors and so on. That is the economic model that we're talking about. And so then the details are negotiable, they're debatable. I don't have the perfect quote unquote economic model. I'm not telling you this is how our resources should be organized and this is what should. There will be certain details that are kind of like debatable and up for discussion depending on the society and the context and the country that we're living in and the time that we're living in. But the general idea should be that. So instead of the general idea being we need to balance the debt, we need to make sure that our credit is good, we need to make sure that we keep on having increasing GDP no matter the income inequality, no matter the suffering on the ground, no matter all of that. Instead of all of that, you flip the base basically. So the basic assumptions that we have are changed, and then we can sort of talk. So that is what appeals to me when it comes to mutual aid. But I wanted to ask you, have you found examples in the case of Lebanon specifically, to kind of bring it back to Lebanon, where mutual aid is already practiced but it's not called that, or where you kind of feel where mutual aid would actually be welcomed, like it's something that people feel that, oh sorry, it's in a situation where people would feel that if mutual aid is practiced, it would actually benefit them, but it's just not practiced because it's not thought of this way.
Yeah, of course. There's I found numerous examples. Of course, none of them really use the term mutual aid. I find that the word Dodom, solidarity, is used much more, but it basically functionally does describe the same thing. Um, I found very few examples pre-Thoda, pre-revolution, and because essentially I think most of those holes before revolution were either filled by charities and NGOs or with the sectarian clientelistic system that we have, which obviously has numerous problems. And a lot of these mutual aid sort of networks we've seen developing really stands in opposition to them because the clientelist systems are quite reactionary and anti-revolution, whereas these are with the supportive of the overthrow of essentially the sectarian system that perpetuates it. So the first one that I noticed that I found really beautiful, because I agree, the moment that we're out on the streets together and I was seeing all these people that I'd seen scattered over the city over the last few years all come together, and also meeting new people was a beautiful feeling of community. So the first aid network that I sort of noticed were the food distribution networks in Lazariya and Sahel Shuhada. Um, Here you had Matbakh al-Balad, you had I forget the
So
other one.
the kitchen of the country is how you
Oh yeah, the kitchen
translate
of the
it.
country, exactly, or the and it was just basically a place where you could volunteer, you could give food products, you could give resources, but they would just cook of food en masse, and it was actually really, really tasty. Actually, the guy does run a very good restaurant, Jai. But essentially, yeah, it adheres so fundamentally to the principles of mutual aid because of exactly where it fits and where it's situated. Fair enough, it didn't aim to kind of create a community, but the community was already forming in the squares and the streets, and so if we describe mutual aid as a process by which revolution meets aid and necessity and kind of just helping one another survive so that we can further push back against these oppressive systems, literally having a stand in a revolutionary square and distributing food keeps people in the squares, right? Because you can't really have a revolution if people go hungry and need to go and work and get food. So it at once it's immediately political by its position, by its sort of like geographical position. And so there I saw an example of mutual aid. And they didn't take anything. They took donations if you wanted, but it was open for anybody. And there were a lot of people in the squares that actually, me and my friends did something similar a few times. We just brought some food and handed it out. And you could tell that there are certain people who are reliant on this food, and there are certain people who aren't. And one thing I found very beautiful is a lot of people were just so willing to give money. Just thank you for doing this, and please take this money. And we're telling them, no, no, we just want to hand out. Anyway, aside from that, we've seen numerous crowdfundings on Facebook. Uh, this again also not aiming towards community building, but this is separate from charity insofar as it centers people's needs. That it's sort of this family needs this and that, and as opposed to we're just handing out random amounts of food and resources and the like. Um, so there are a few other things. Then there are things that are happening mostly in the north, which really excite me because these are very new as far as I'm aware in Lebanon. There is an organization called Haba, Harakat Haba, which translates to the basil movement. I don't know. I asked the guy why it's basil, and he just said because basil is not like that fundamental of a produce in Lebanon. I was thinking maybe like baqdounis because it's parsley because it's more consumed, but it doesn't. I don't know. It doesn't have the same ring. So anyway, Haba is a cooperative agricultural kind of movement that explicitly talk about returning to the land. That it originally just started with this guy Murad Ayash, who posted on Facebook, had this idea, and posted on Facebook, I have this idea, I want to start farming, and I want to start like creating this cooperative agriculture a system. So if anyone has any land, anyone has any resources, hit me up. And it gained quite a bit of traction. Because, first of all, there is that same thing we were talking about earlier, where people really were realizing that, well, the state isn't going to help us. The sectarian clientelist system is incredibly corrupt, and basically we're having this revolution to overthrow it. And so there's that impetus for it, there's that motivation. But then matched with that, there is also a lot of unused fertile land in Lebanon. Um, so basically, yeah, it's been a few months, and I check up on them, and they're doing well and farming, and sort of it has educational purposes as well. That in Sahat al-Nur and Tripoli, they've held numerous kind of meetings where they sort of talk about cooperative agriculture and sustainability, and they're explicitly organic and talk about the same things we're talking about sustainability relating to one another because there's also something that's very interesting about things like this as opposed to charity, which is there's I don't want to use the word dignity, but there's something if handing food out as opposed to allowing people to work and to sort of feed themselves and to sort of like be part of a community. There's sort of a more sense of belonging, and it's kind of empowering, right?
Yeah.
So
Especially if you get to know the people who are participating in this, and then like if you are participating in a soup kitchen in the morning, and then you kind of you run into the same person in the afternoon, then the relationship between you two has already changed. You're no longer just he's not just the person that you bought a coffee from, that other
Yeah.
day, and that's the extent of the relationship. There's actually something beyond it at this point.
No, yeah, and
Um,
there's something quite jarring about how we're actually kind of a very collectivist society, but at the same time very stratified. That like, yeah, the person I get my coffee from, I mean, me personally, I do, but most people they don't really have a relationship with them.
mm.
Um,
Yeah,
but
I
yeah,
mean, it's the paradox of, for me, collectivism and individualism, like, they end up being binaries that don't explain much, but
no,
there
yeah,
is definitely a sense, or at least let's put it that way. It's part of this perceived identity that we have. We always tell ourselves, especially, and we tell foreigners especially, that we are, a welcoming culture, a
yeah,
welcoming society. We like to indifference, like, we like to
mm,
just what's the word, like, we like to welcome people. We like to have
hospitable and
them.
everything. Yeah,
Yeah, a hospitable culture, exactly.
yeah,
But yeah, I mean, that is one thing, but then even hospitable for me can be a bit limiting, because you can say, well, I'm bringing you inside, but that's it. Like, I still want a limit between us. But I mean, it would still be a step forward, I suppose. And I guess that brings me to
Oh,
the final.
there are a few other examples I'd like to bring up before we move on, if you don't mind.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, so there are other things happening in the north. I find it very strange because the north is usually a bit neglected politically. I think that's maybe one of the reasons why. But somewhere in Kura, a guy named Ala Farhat, also working in cooperative agriculture. But he especially, I find very interesting because he's developed a kind of a development council. Um, and he sort of created a mini ministry to sort of like deal with all circled around agriculture, but like the education around this, the acquiring of goods, and he's creating a small seed bank. Uh, Especially in a country with such fertile land, I find these cooperative agriculture movements quite interesting. There are a few examples of rooftop farmings, of urban agriculture,
Mm.
which is something that I'm very excited about because we have so much sun, we have so much soil, and so many resources. I've heard of one in a Palestinian camp, I believe Burj Barajne. You linked me one actually today in Furn al-Shabak. Um, and along with that, this is something I really want to mention only because it's a slightly different way of thinking, seeing mutual aid, and relates to what we're talking about relating to one another. There's a Facebook group called Isra, which means
Plant.
farm, right? It's a plant,
Yeah, farm.
yeah.
Farm, yeah.
Or the verb of. But either way,
Mm.
and basically it's a community of around 20,000 people, explicitly opened up by a few engineers, I believe, who want to disseminate what they describe as best practices in farming, organic farming. But essentially, what it functions as is a community of people who are all interested in agriculture, in urban agriculture and large farms, and it serves such an educational purpose. First of all, with in terms of cooperation and just sort of helping each other out and talking to each other. And I mean, I have a small little urban garden I'm farming, growing on my balcony, and God knows I've sent them dozens of photos. Like, I have these tomato plants that the flowers dropped, and I was heartbroken. So I send them a photo, and some guys, just one person, 10 minutes later, sends me, "Oh, these are fine. You can actually pinch these off. The next ones will grow better." Or you're watering too much, it needs this nitrate, it needs this, what's it called? Because there's quite a lot to know, actually.
Mm.
And so that sort of, yeah, mutual sharing of information and education matched with the need for agriculture, and eventually we're going to see this much more in Lebanon, the need for food security. This is actually one of my new favorite things, Isra. I follow it. I see the posts every day, and because it's so supportive as well. So yeah,
And here I'll mention that, like, everything we just mentioned, I will link them in the description and on the blog post as well. Well, listen, Ayman. I mean, that's all I had to say on mutual aid. It's just one of those topics that I know we can just go on for hours and hours and just tell people, hey, you should read up on it, and this is important and everything. But ultimately, what we're saying, I guess, with all of this is that this is already happening around you. Like, these things are already happening. We're not inventing anything new. It's been happening for a long time. It's been happening for centuries, for that matter. we're just arguing for we're arguing for it. We're saying that we need actually more of this and not less of this. We need to turn what we think of how we interact with one another within a state of exception. Like again, in the case of a pandemic, people feeling that they're more generous, like their priorities are, let's say, better priorities. It's no longer just about survival of the fittest and all of that. Into something that is more general. Like you don't actually need to have a pandemic for people to start thinking that we need to be better towards one another and have a better society. So on that is my final note, if you want. Is there anything that you want to sort of conclude on or just have general reflections on?
No, yeah, this is one of those topics that I go on for hours about, and I get so worked up that I can't really stop. I've got a lot that I could continue, but I guess that may be for another conversation.
I'm sure that we can have lots of parts. As I said, like this is going to be the first of hopefully many. But like, yeah, with that in mind, like really thank you a lot for your time.
No, thank you. I had a lot of fun with this.
Me too.